Hello and welcome to my Vray 3 for Rhino 6 emissive materials tutorial. So today we're going to talk about emissive materials and specifically the way I like to use emissive materials, and that's for interior lighting. So in the previous tutorial, what we did was we looked at the various different ways point lights can get an interior space to glow, and we sort of ended with this image here where we have just one point light inside and our whole unit is glowing in a nice warm way, and we have that balance that we're always trying to get where you can see inside, you can start to make out some furniture and some bits and pieces in there, but you get the reflection of the sky as well. So we're getting that, both that, which helps make the glass feel very realistic and also is making sure you're showing off your project and that you can see interior and exterior spaces simultaneously. But like I have mentioned before, adding that linear light will increase render time. So in a small little house like this, it maybe is worth it to just have that light in there because you're getting some nice glow. But this project is also maybe not the best example because it's one big open space. So say your building has 200 different spaces, you can't just have one light here or one light in every single room necessarily, because your render time is going to be exponentially increasing as you add lights. And if you have 200 lights in your model, don't be surprised if it takes multiple days to render. So as we all know as architects, that's not a luxury we typically have. So I want to talk about using emissives to create this effect, but not increase the render time itself. So to do that, first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and delete the light that I already have in there. So if I go to my lighting, there's my Omni light. Again, this was set to the linear decay, intensity of 1, a nice warm color. Let's just delete that light. So now we're down to no interior lights, meaning that this would just render as a pure reflection because it'd just be black in there. But let's go to our materials and create something that will have more or less the same effect, but sort of come at it at a different direction. So for this, I'm going to just create a generic material. There is an option to make an emissive material, but I'm going to make a generic material and add an emissive layer, and I'll explain why as we move through. So make a generic material. I'm going to call this glowing interior wall, because that's exactly what it's going to be. So our generic default material is going to come in as just a medium gray. What I want to do is change my color, and I'm going to make this be something that's a little bit more like a glowing wall. So again, it's almost like creating that same color that we did with the light. So here we have a set of nice, warm, glowy, yellowy orange, maybe a little bit more orange. And we can see that there. It sort of looks like a wall that had a light shine on it, which is what we're going to be doing. But what I want to do now is go to this layered material option here with this little plus sign and click here and add an emissive layer. So what an emissive layer does is it's a layer that's glowing. And the easiest way to think about this is it's sort of like it turns your wall into an LED screen, if you will. So right now my screen is just set to white, so it's just glowing white. If I change this color again to something that's more in this nice warm yellow range, now what we see is a wall that's glowing warm and orange. So let's see what that does to our image here. So we're essentially turning our interior walls into a glowing version of themselves. So rather than having a light hitting the wall and making it glow orange, we're just making the wall itself glow orange. One quick note, if you're making a new material, you need to uncheck the can be overridden, because again, when I'm in my settings over here, my material override is turned on, and I'm overriding things to just light gray. So all of my materials right now, except for this new one we just made and the glass, are doing light gray, or rendering as light gray, and that's because I'm not too concerned about seeing the wood and the concrete right now. I just want to see how, if my lighting effect is correct. So again, back to where we left off. So this is what it looks like with the point light in there. We're trying to recreate this effect of seeing the warm glow, and also seeing some of the furniture, but not losing our reflection. So if I go to my interior layers, go to my walls, click on my material, and I'll attribute it to that new glowing interior wall that we created. Click OK, click OK. Let's go ahead and render and see how we're doing. All right, so we can see here, this is getting pretty close just off that first test. We are able to see inside. I can make out the stairs and some objects right here. And we're still getting our reflections, but this is probably a little bit too intense, right? It's almost getting a little bit too glowy in there. It doesn't feel quite natural with what the rest of the scene is rendering. So let's go back in and just tweak that just a little bit. First, I think we were just maybe a little bit too yellow. I'm going to get a little bit more on the orange side of that, actually. Yeah, something right about there. And I'm going to, rather than changing the intensity to turn it down, because we feel like it might be a little bit high, I'm going to play with the transparency. So what the transparency is going to do, it's going to be the transparency for just this emissive layer. So, and it runs on a black and white scale. So if I turn it all the way white, now you can see we're just looking at our typical diffuse layer below. And the main difference I want to point out here is not that the color is necessarily that different, it's that there's some depth to the material. So when it's just a material that's not glowing, you can see where the edge is kind of round, but when it's glowing, it comes out as very flat. It's just a solid color. So again, if we use this LED screen analogy, and our interior walls, you know, are essentially rendering as an iPad that's set to a certain color. You can imagine if the walls bend and move and it's all set to one color at a distance, you're not going to be able to read the changes that the wall is doing in plan because it gets too flattened by everything being glowing the same color. So to lessen that effect, I'm actually just going to make that layer more transparent. So again, if I go all the way, now I'm not glowing anymore. If I go all the way bright, I'm glowing so much that I can't even see the depth of the material itself. So if I go sort of somewhere in the middle there, now I'm glowing enough and I can see the subtle changes in the geometry of the object itself that's glowing. So for walls, this is more like walls turning and bending and walls transitioning to ceilings. And it won't be that sort of overwhelming glow. So I kind of, you know, I have my iPad screen and I just, rather than turning down the glowiness, I sort of made the iPad itself more transparent so I can see the wall behind it. So let's render that out and see if that gets us where we want. And so I only need to render a small little window here. So I'm only concerned with how my glass relationship is balancing the inside versus the outside. All right, as this wraps up, we can kind of see exactly we're getting that perfect kind of warm glow coming out of our house. I can make out some of the elements. I can see the chair and the couch in there. I can just start to make out the stairs over here, but I'm getting that balance, that layering of I can see what's inside, I can see the reflection outside, but you know, they're kind of layering on top of each other in a way that makes it feel like glass, and it makes it feel like you understand the depth of the project. So you can imagine how this translates to a multifamily building or an office tower where you can just control what layer your interior walls are. So right now, all my interior walls in my big lofty space are all rendered this here. But if I had a multi-floor, I can go and pick and choose and select every other unit or randomly pick a bunch of different floors or rooms put those on their own interior wall layer, and then I can have different interior walls render at different intensities so that I get that all of the units have lights on, but different amounts of lights, and I'm just sort of faking how bright it is in the unit. And if you stand back and look at that as a whole, it'll have that realistic, night or dusk skyline look. But you're not having to put point lights in every single room to make that happen. And so here in just one single room, we see that it sort of has the same effect. The downside is, of course, that we're not getting the glow out. So why this, iPad wall, we'll call it, is glowing and warming up the inside, it's not going to be strong enough to glow and hit the ground and the walls like the point light did. That kind of has an even more atmospheric interior glow. So there's a little bit of downside that you lose that exterior glow out, but you do get the balancing act that you want for the glass, and the ability to read the depth within. So now I want to do another sort of taking that concept to the next level. So this is really just making it look like things are, sort of bleak, and there's no art or anything on the wall. It's just, what if lights were glowing on the wall? It'd just be a yellowy color. But if you take that concept further, what you can do is, think about the iPad just set to a glowy orange. What if the iPad was set to an elevation of a whole room, meaning that there were shelves and art and a TV and a chair? That image might look something like this. So this is just an image I found online of an elevation of a typical apartment. It's sort of generic enough, and that's purposeful that it's very generic. That I found, I took this into Photoshop, I exaggerated the contrast and the yellows to make it feel like it's got that warm view of like a dusk time. But it's really just a dumb texture. And what I want to do is, instead of just using, if you look at this wall and where my cursor is, this was sort of the color we were faking. Now we're going to fake it with an entire image of a wall. So let's build that material. So if we go back to our glowing interior wall material, actually let's just make a new one from scratch. We'll go to add material, generic, and we'll call this interior walls with decorations. Something like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change my diffuse layer to be the image itself. So when I click on my little foursquare, go to my bitmap, it pulls up my search bar here. So I'm going to go and get the image that I want to use. Click open. Back. So now I've made a material that maps that living room. Then I'm going to create, just like before, an emissive layer. And I'm going to, instead of just being a color this time, I'm going to actually go and select that same image again. Okay, and back. And now I have this, the emissive layer is just a still image of a living room elevation. So let's go ahead and replace just the glowing interior wall with the interior walls with decorations material that we just made, because that's really all we have to do is just override the emissive with an image itself. Make sure we change it in our actual Rhino. Interior walls with decorations. And before I forget, because we just made a new material and we have our material override still running, that new material we just made, we have to go in to our material options and uncheck this. Otherwise, it'll just render it as light gray. So now let's look at how that renders. Come back here. All right, so we can see that that image is mapped on the inside, but something doesn't look quite right. And so we can see it's mapped in there, but it's so repetitive that we can see it being repeated all over, and the scale's off. It's actually rotated the wrong way. If we look, you can see those shelves are sideways. The color, if we kind of zoom out and just blur our eyes a little bit, the glowiness inside is sort of correct, but it doesn't make sense. It's like a weird, ugly wallpaper or something now. So just like we had to do with any other material mapping, we have to do it with this one. So if we come inside this, we can change the mapping so that it is the right scale of the inside. So I'm going to come inside a little bit here. And if I look at this in the rendered view, should be able to kind of, it's a little washed out. I think I have my lighting settings to not show this quite right. But I can sort of do it without seeing what's happening because I know how it's supposed to look. So on this wall right here, if I go to my texture mapping, I'm just going to delete any mapping that was attributed to that wall. I'm going to make a new box mapping. I'm just going to select somewhere here at the base of the wall. This image, again, if we remember from our material mapping tutorial, we need to put in the scale. And so this image happens to be designed for a 20-foot by 20-foot room. So I'm going to put in 20 feet by 20 feet. And then for the height, I'm actually just going to stretch this to make sure it comes up and hits my ceiling. So you can see my mapping widget is scaling that image to the size of a whole room. Hit enter again. Now let's come back, and basically what I've done is just taken this image and scaled it to the real life scale, whereas before it was coming in, rotated, and copied at a really small, maybe like the whole room was only 3 feet wide. So if we come back to our view here, and re-render our small window. So now if we take a look at this, what we see is something that feels like this whole living room is now decorated. Like there's things on the wall, there's TVs mounted, and while it's not perfect, it's not meant to be perfect. It's meant to be a sort of quick and dirty way to make it feel like you populated the whole living room and populated it with lights, but without taking the time to model stuff, model paintings, model shelves, and adding lights, which would slow down the rendering. So you're getting all of that stuff. You're getting that layering, that nice inside and outside. So where the darker spot on the glass is happening because of the tree reflection, you can really see in there. And I can't quite make out what it is. It's just a little bit of interior noise, I like to call it. But on the reflections, because the sky is lighter than the inside, that area, you mostly see the beautiful sunset reflections. And then on this right side of the glass, where my glass is reflecting my, my gray wall, that is darker, so I see inside, and I see just, some variation in the glowiness, some bright spots, some dark spots, something on the wall. I don't need to know exactly what it is, because when I zoom out and look at it, I'm getting that nice layering. The glass feels very crisp and reflective, and it feels like the interior space is brought to life. But I didn't spend any time doing all that detail. So again, if we think about using this technique on a multifamily building or an office tower or something like that, where you have hundreds and hundreds of rooms, and you're likely not going to have the time to model all the furniture. And even if you modeled a sofa or found a sofa online and copied it into every single room or some desk, that's going to slow down your model. It's going to make it really bogged down. And then if you're putting lights in that room, it'll take it forever to render. This, far enough away, even though it's repetitive, the view towards every room will be just different enough that it'll look like there's some interior noise and some interior lighting that's different on every single unit, but it's really just the same dumb elevation copied around. So it's a very fast way to get some realistic looking glass and interior lighting. And so we'll stop there with our emissives, and the next tutorial will be on doing interior lighting while actually rendering from the interior.